Hello, this is Cryptolyze. I hope you are well on this Thursday, 19 October 2023. We meet today to talk about crypto, to talk about BTC, to talk about news because we still have a lot of things happening, whether at the level of the SEC, whether at the level of earnings. The period which is really important for the Nasdaq, for the S&P 500 in which we start to have returns from companies, we start now. As a reminder, you always have the possibility of having free access to the educational course, which is a 60-hour training course worth €400, which allows you to learn blockchain, crypto, investment, technical analysis, trading, everything to become profitable. Through 130 videos, 400 pages of guides, quizzes to find out where you are in your progress, and all for free. To have access to this lifelong training, simply use the platform of one of our partners. Everything is explained in the comments and descriptions. We'll start with the interview with Gary Gensler, in which he had questions about spot BTC ETFs. So clearly I like the answer saying I'm not a judge, my teams are working on it. So they are completely clear of the information that is being spread, or at least of how it can be put in place. I will not be the prejudge of what will happen, implying that it is these teams who will decide, these teams who are analyzing the situation. So I think that, in fact, we are not going to get feedback right away. If we are really in this process with this type of communication, I think we will have to be patient, especially since we have allegations that will be relatively strong, in particular Elizabeth Warren, who joins more than 100 legislators to ask for Biden to prevent, well, generally put in place, a plan to prevent crypto financing of terrorism. So what is interesting is that it is something that comes up quite systematically, and obviously with what is happening in the Middle East, we have a return of this demand. And to know that we always base ourselves on information which is not necessarily positive, and I really like the response we got here from Chain Analysis, which goes back to the reports which are used to determine if the crypto is used or not by terrorism. And what is interesting is that, in fact, not so much the article itself breaks down a little bit all the different allegations that have been given, and comes the conclusion that, yes, it can be used in some cases, but it's really very weak. We're talking about $82 million, when in reality it's more like 450,000. So we are still in a difference that is just colossal. Yes, there are indeed elements which show that there is financing which can go from this style, but it remains excessively low compared to the general volume, and that it is the same principle in that moment with cash, with fiat. So at some point, to say that the financing of terrorism only goes through crypto, and that it is very important to prevent it, or even to crush cryptos because we have to prevent that part, we are still in the excessive party to see the return that there will be, but in all cases that is clearly an element of pressure, which will play here, which will play in favor of Gary Gensler, depending on the different returns that he does. And once again, we are not safe from him refusing the ETFs and then waiting for the different players to reoffer the ETFs once again. So we have to keep that in mind because it is in progress to increase, and I think it will continue to increase. In terms of news, we have some news that is not necessarily positive on Binance. Binance France, Stephanie Cabocioras has left the company. She was the general director, so generally who is behind the president of Binance France. And what bothers me a little is the setting up of her departure, namely that she is a former member of the AMF. Very important. And the purpose of her historic recruitment in April 2022 was really the legal part, because she came in as legal director, and her purpose was to make Binance compliant. And there, the fact that she is leaving is not a good sign. It is not a good sign at the moment that we have a blockage of funds at the level of France. So yes, there was a partner who is no longer there. They are looking for a solution, but we do not have a resolution date. In relation to this solution, they were informed in advance, we ourselves were informed in advance that there was no longer going to be a solution to manage the euros, and we still have no solution. So it bothers me a little when I start to see all this, and especially see that we also have big players who are leaving, big people who are leaving Binance in general, whether in the US or Binance International. These are key points of attention that must have at a given moment and systematically redirect. In any case, do not leave these funds stagnated at Binance if ever you are only on Binance. Don't forget to try to diversify your exchanges, especially if you have centralized exchanges and only operate through centralized ones. And besides, I have commented some tutorial videos for you if you are interested in testing other platforms, or in any case, not only staying on a single platform. So, a little interesting moment perhaps, because we often talk about the notion of restacking, and I wanted to come back to it because there is an article which is very interesting from Cointelegraph in which they explain what restacking is, and especially the usefulness it has, and the risks it has. So already in terms of risks, what is important to know is that Vitalik Buterin is against restacking, because for him, he considers that it adds an additional layer of risk to Ethereum. We must understand that stacking, therefore not restacking, but simply stacking, serves to protect the blockchain. We put these tokens, therefore these ethers, into play within the framework of Ethereum to be able to protect the Ethereum blockchain, and restacking is stacking these ethers to protect Ethereum, and then continuing to stack them on another blockchain or another application or another protocol to protect this protocol. So here we are in an approach that is different from what we know in terms of shared security, for example, like Cosmos, because we use the same token to do other things in other protocols. And the risk, in fact, which is linked to that and which scares Vitalik Buterin is the addition of layers of risk, implied if ever there is a defect at a given moment on a protocol or on another blockchain. In fact, we can have a strong breakout in the stacking of Ethereum, and therefore for him it is a risk which is not worth the candle. And here we also explain a little bit why it can be interesting and why certain blockchains will need this notion of restacking, because precisely we have a desire to protect and diversify the security sources at the level of the different branches. One can have their own nodes and actually use shared security across Ethereum. Is this the right solution for Ethereum? I don't necessarily think, given that Ethereum itself is a very complex element and still under development, it would really be too early for me this type of implementation. I leave you the article. Certainly I will put it on Twitter directly so that you can say it. Really very interesting. In terms of news, we have had building permits which are a bit higher. So it's rather positive for the American economy, rather negative for stocks, because that means there is room to be able to have an impact at the level of the Fed. And what is going to be really important today is going to be the classic weekly unemployment registrations, the manufacturing index, which is going to be really important, the sale of existing homes. I think we will be a little bit at the above or equivalent at this level, because if we have the building permits, it means that the existing will continue to rise. And what will be interesting to see, it will be this week and next week, in which we have quite a few earnings. And yes, we arrive in the earnings season, so a very important season where we learn, in fact, we have the balance sheets of the different companies over the last quarter, and that's where we see whether yes or no the economy is really holding up. And we are not going to hide the fact that when we look at the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ, it really depends on a handful of companies, and which mainly arrive next week. We have a little bit of this week next week, in which we will have Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Visa. It's heavy, it's really heavy, in which we have a lot of information. And when we look at the S&P 500, we see that we had a really aggressive day yesterday with a close below the pressures, so we are really in the process of validating the bearish breakout and the bearish continuity that we had in mind. Target, we recall, 4,100, in which we were looking here, and this is also seen at the level of the RSI, where we had here an acceleration of the momentum to prepare for a fall of the momentum and return here to oversold, therefore rather classic. And when we compare the NASDAQ to the S&P 500, we still have something that is a little bit sexier. Clearly, we see that we have not broken any lows. We are managing to hold on in these areas. We must not hide the fact that these figures are driven by two things. It's driven, one, by just a handful of companies, and two, even worse, it's driven by a narrative that is close to artificial intelligence and production gains. I think I'll definitely talk about it this weekend, this notion of production gains in relation to the general economy and the notion of inflation, the notion of growth. And is this what would really make it possible to achieve a very good rebound in the American economy? I don't necessarily think so, but nevertheless here, the attraction of comparing the two shows us that the earnings are going to be really very important, whether for the NASDAQ and the S&P 500, and to push the S&P 500 much more than the NASDAQ. When it comes to oil, we see that it's really a struggle. I told you that yesterday's closing was really important. We see that we closed on it, so for me I still have no signal, so we will wait another day or even perhaps the week to be sure to have the close below this retest, or at above this retest, which will determine whether yes or no we will break these 93 to go much higher, and therefore have an oil which will carry general inflation, and which will put pressure on the American economy. We continue with BTC. We are still in our very important zone, ranging above our support zone. In the long term, it doesn't change much. In the short term, we still had movements which are important, because if we really look in an hour, we will see very quickly that we had this swipe here of higher liquidity. So I spoke to you about it just before it happened, really a few hours before, or even a half hour before, or 40 minutes before. And then, we did exactly the opposite movement. We went to get the liquidity at the bottom, except that we didn't actually go to get them. Okay, we reinforced liquidity. When we look at the level that has been created, what is interesting is that this level is really all the liquidity that is here. Okay, we really have all the liquidity that are there. Moreover, we are going to note them. Presto, tac, the liquidity is here, and therefore, inevitably for me, we are going to have a bearish breakout to go and get this liquidity there, and always go for this level of the 27,700. And there we will ask ourselves the question, okay, are we a form of accumulation? That is to say, do we have something that is structured in this style there, taking of liquidity, hop on, rebuilt from above, and we start again there, I have a nice accumulation with a rather classic SCST spring, or I find myself with a huge candle which swipes everything, and so there I do nothing because quite simply there I find myself with a falling knife, so I'm absolutely not going to trade this kind of thing or see doing something supportive if I ever break at this level to go support here, just this level. But still, it's really risky, so in general, I refrain. But we are here in a consolidation of liquidity, and that is visible in several things anyway. Notably here, heat map. We see that we went for the higher liquidity, then we made the downward movement, we has cannibalized apart. But we still have here this liquidity. Look closely at this level of liquidity, 154, 154. So we see that we have a little bit of liquidity which is in the process of reforming in particular here in short. But it remains relatively weak for me. We is still relatively far. And when we look here at the perpetuals, we see that the open interest is still flat. So we have no effective movement like top trader. So we is still in a form of incomprehension of the market. At the level, for example, of perpetuals on Binance, we have no one who is in the process of positioning themselves because we have no movement. Is that logical? We zoom out, we are in a range equal, no flow, therefore equal normal, no trend, which is in the process of forming, so here no trend, whether long or short, because we have no train. And I remember we are not currently in a tailspin, we are in a hunt for liquidity, which is also in a range. It is a tailing technique which is particular and which is really dangerous when you are not used to it. We're just being very careful. For me, in all cases, I strongly think that my bias remains bearish at first before seeing whether or not we break this important level, if this level holds up. At that point, we could quite easily go find the 30,000 to retest what? Well, retest hop, we zoom back to the top of the range and potentially go and test these two highs, which are here to close a new one, and then go and retest the same. So we would still be in this approach, and which is rather logical lethargy. I remind you that we are in a form of lateralization to force general lethargy. Before having a real strong movement, and this strong movement will arrive through news strong, and that's really important. After the hook for me, it will be 1, the earnings which will arrive, 2, something that must be monitored is the TTL being here an ETF, iShare, therefore BlackRock, which represents American bonds and in which we continue to sink. It's really dangerous. We are at 84. I think that if we break the 80s, we will have a signal that will be really very strong for the American economy, and we could have a default in the American economy. And the same, I will certainly come back to this in the video. Just a little clarification that I forgot to make in the new part yesterday. I was wrong on a little information in particular on the holders of the FTX debt. I am sorry for you. Unfortunately, it will be 90% of what they have recovered. So that is to say, 90% of the 60% that they were able to recover. So we are far from what I had attested and what I had read in the article, which was 90% of the total funds. So I'm really sorry to you, but in any case already the fact of being able to recover 60% is enormous, knowing that many other platforms it was much less so. We will wait to see the real figures, and in any case, I'm crossing my fingers for you, and I hope you like this video. If so, don't forget to leave me a like and a comment. It always makes me very happy, and then we'll see each other again at 13:30 time to talk about VRA, the Veracity crypto, in which we had an update in terms of tokens and issues. I'm going to give you an update on my opinion, and it's at 13:30.